The day my mother threw my grandfather's passbook into the trash, she did it like it was nothing, like it was an old grocery receipt or a broken pen. She tossed it without looking twice, without pausing, without a single word to me. I was standing 3 feet away and she still did not look at my face. That passbook had been sitting on Grandpa's bedside table for as long as I could remember. I had seen it 100 times, I never knew what was inside it. And on the morning my mother decided it meant nothing, it turned out to be the one thing that meant everything. Before I tell you what the bank manager found, I want to ask you something real. Have you ever watched someone throw away a piece of your life like it had no value? Have you ever been standing in the same room while someone decided your future did not matter enough to ask about? If you have felt that, stay with me, because what Grandpa left behind was not just money, it was a message. And it took one phone call from a stranger to finally make my family hear it. My name is Lauja, and I am going to tell you a story about a passbook, a bank manager, and the moment my family finally ran out of ways to pretend I did not exist. I was 31 years old when my grandfather passed away. His name was Edmund, but everyone in the family called him Papa Ed. He was a quiet man, not the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable, but the kind that made you feel safe. He did not talk much, but when he looked at you, you knew he saw you, really saw you, not the version of you that was useful or convenient, the real version. Papa Ed had lived in the same house for 43 years. A small cream-colored house at the end of a narrow street with a garden he cared for like it was a second family. He grew tomatoes along the left fence, kept a row of marigolds near the porch, and had one old lemon tree in the back that he said his own father had planted before he was born. That lemon tree still gave fruit every year. Papa Ed said that was proof that some things outlast the people who start them. He had 2 children, my mother, Renata, and her younger brother, my Uncle Cass, and he had 3 grandchildren, my cousins Marcus and Britta, who belonged to Uncle Cass, and me, Lauja, Renata's only daughter. I was the one who lived closest to Papa Ed, not because I was told to, not because anyone assigned me the job. I stayed close because I wanted to, because he was the one person in my family who had always made me feel like showing up was enough. My mother had a different relationship with Papa Ed. It was not cold exactly, but it was managed. She called him on Sundays, she visited on his birthday and at Christmas. She made sure there were flowers on the table when she came, and she always wore something nice, like the visit was a performance she had rehearsed. She was not a bad daughter, but she was not a present one either. I was the one who drove Papa Ed to his doctor appointments. I was the one who sat with him on Saturday afternoons when he could not sleep and did not want to be alone. I was the one who learned how he took his tea, which drawer held his reading glasses, and which television program he liked to fall asleep to. I did all of that without being asked. I did it because I loved him, not because I expected anything in return. That is the part I want you to hold on to. I never expected anything. Papa Ed passed on a Thursday in late autumn. It was not sudden. He had been declining for about 8 months, a slow and quiet fading that matched the way he had always lived. He did not fight it loudly. He just got smaller and softer and eventually still. I was with him when he went. My mother was not. She had called that morning to say she would come after lunch, but by the time she arrived, Papa Ed was already gone. She cried in the hallway. She held his hand even after he had passed. I did not say anything about being late. I did not bring it up. I stood beside her and let her grieve the way she needed to. The next morning, my mother began going through his things. I want to describe this carefully because I think the way someone handles a person's belongings after they die tells you a great deal about what they valued in that person's life. My mother moved through Papa Ed's house quickly, not cruelly but efficiently. She had a box for donations, a box for things she wanted to keep, and a garbage bag for things she considered trash. She worked with the energy of someone completing a task they had been meaning to get to. I was in the bedroom when she picked up the passbook from the bedside table. I recognized it immediately. It was a small navy blue book with a faded gold logo on the cover. Papa Ed had kept it there for years. I had seen him open it sometimes when he thought no one was watching, just looking at it quietly before tucking it back under his reading lamp. My mother picked it up, turned it over once, and dropped it into the garbage bag. I said, that was Papa Ed's bank passbook. She said it's an old savings account, probably nothing in it. He had everything moved to the main account years ago. I said, should we at least check? She said, Lauja, I am busy, let me handle this. And she kept moving. I did not take the passbook out of the bag, I wish I had, but I had spent so many years not wanting to make things uncomfortable in my family that the instinct to step back was faster than the instinct to speak up. I told myself she probably knew what she was talking about. She was his daughter. She handled his paperwork sometimes. I was just the granddaughter who drove him to appointments. That is what I told myself. 3 days passed, the house was being cleared. The family had gathered, meaning my mother and Uncle Cass and his 2 kids, Marcus and Britta. There was a lawyer present for a brief reading of the will. Papa Ed had left the house to both of his children equally to be sold and split. His furniture and personal items were to be distributed as the family agreed. His primary bank account would go through the estate process. There was no mention of a secondary account. There was no mention of the passbook. My mother seemed satisfied with this. Uncle Cass seemed satisfied. Marcus and Britta were already talking about what their parents' share might eventually become. I sat quietly in the corner and said nothing. That might have been the end of the story, except that 4 days after the will reading, I got a phone call from a man named Gerald Osei. He told me he was the branch manager at a small local bank about 20 minutes from Papa Ed's house. He told me he had known Papa Ed for close to 15 years, and he told me that there was an account at his branch that had Lauja Marie Fontaine listed as the sole beneficiary and that he had been trying to reach the estate for several days without a response. I sat down on my kitchen floor when he said that, not dramatically, my legs just stopped holding me up. Gerald explained that Papa Ed had opened a dedicated savings account at that branch back when I was 16 years old. Over the course of 15 years, he had made regular deposits. Small ones at first, $20 here, $50 there, then larger ones as he sold some old land he had inherited from his own parents. Gerald told me the account had not been touched in 2 years because Papa Ed had decided at that point that it was ready, that it was complete. Gerald could not tell me the exact balance over the phone. He said I would need to come in person with identification. But he told me it was significant and that Papa Ed had left clear written instructions inside the account file along with a sealed letter addressed to me personally. I called my mother that night. She was quiet for a long time after I explained. Then she said, "That doesn't sound right, Papa Ed would have told me." I said maybe he didn't want to. She said, "Lauja, are you sure this man is legitimate? You shouldn't go alone, let me come with you." I thought about the passbook in the garbage bag. I thought about the years of driving and sitting and learning how he took his tea. I thought about the way she had said it's probably nothing without even opening the cover. I told her I would handle it myself. She did not like that answer, but I gave it anyway. I went to the bank 2 days later. Gerald Osei met me at the door. He was a sturdy, soft-spoken man in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the calm energy of someone who had worked with people during important moments for a very long time. He shook my hand and said, "Your grandfather talked about you often." He was very proud. I had to press my lips together to keep myself steady. He brought me into a private office. He verified my identity carefully and thoroughly. Then he opened the account file and placed a printed statement in front of me. The balance was $214,000. I stared at that number for a long time. I think Gerald gave me the space to do that because he did not say anything. He just sat across from me with his hands folded and let me breathe. Papa Ed had been putting money away for me since I was 16 years old. For 15 years, he had never mentioned it. He had never hinted at it. He had never made me feel like I owed him anything or like he was doing something special. He had just quietly, consistently, deliberately built something for me and then waited until the right time to let me find it. Gerald then placed a sealed envelope on the desk. My name was on the front in Papa Ed's handwriting. The ink was a little shaky, the way it had been in his last 2 years, but the letters were careful and clear. He said he wrote that about 14 months ago. He asked us to keep it in the file and make sure you received it personally. I opened it there with Gerald sitting quietly across from me. I am not going to share every word Papa Ed wrote in that letter because some of it is mine to keep, but I will tell you the parts that matter to this story. He wrote that he had watched me for a long time. He wrote that he had noticed who showed up and who did not. He wrote that he knew I never asked for recognition, which was exactly why he wanted to make sure I received something real. He wrote that he was not angry at the rest of the family. He said that people love in the ways they know how, and some people only know how to love from a comfortable distance. But he said he wanted me to have something that would give me room. Room to breathe, room to choose, room to stop needing other people's approval to feel like I had value. The last line of the letter said, "You were always seen, Lauja. I just wanted to make sure you knew it." I sat in that office and cried in a way I had not cried since I was a child. Not sad crying. The kind of crying that comes when something you needed to hear finally reaches you after a very long wait. Gerald quietly passed me a box of tissues and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. After I composed myself, we went through the paperwork together. Gerald walked me through the process clearly and carefully. Because I was the named sole beneficiary on a properly established account with documentation, the funds were not considered part of the estate. They did not go through the will, they did not require family agreement, they were mine. I want you to understand what that means in practical terms. My mother had thrown that passbook in the garbage. She had decided without looking that it held nothing of value, and in doing so, she had discarded the only physical evidence that this account existed. If Gerald had not called me directly, if he had not had my contact information from the account file itself, I might never have known. Papa Ed had thought of that too. Gerald told me that Papa Ed had specifically asked him about 2 years before he passed to keep my personal contact information on file and to reach out to me directly if anything happened to him. He had not trusted the estate process to make sure I was notified. He had arranged a backup quietly and practically the same way he did everything. My grandfather had known his family well enough to plan around them. I drove home in silence that day. I did not call my mother. I did not call Uncle Cass. I sat with the information alone for 3 full days and let myself feel everything without performing anything. During those 3 days, I thought a great deal about the 15 years that money had been sitting in that account. I thought about the times I had quietly worried about my future. I had a steady job as a records coordinator at a local hospital, but I had never been able to save much. My rent was manageable but not cheap. My car needed work more often than it should. There had been moments when I had borrowed small amounts from my mother and felt the weight of that debt in every conversation afterward. She never let those loans breathe freely. They came up at the wrong moments, phrased as concern but carrying a ledger underneath. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about Papa Ed sitting in his little navy blue chair on Saturday afternoons while I made him tea, and him knowing all along that he had quietly made sure I would be okay. I had never felt so loved and so sad at the same time. On the fourth day, I called Gerald back to finalize a few paperwork questions. He mentioned, almost in passing, that someone had called the bank the day before asking about Papa Ed's accounts. The caller had identified themselves as a family member handling the estate. It was not a name Gerald could share, but the timing told me everything I needed to know. I called my mother that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. She normally let my calls go to the third or fourth ring. The fact that she answered quickly told me she was waiting. I said I finished the bank process. There was a pause, then she said, "And how much was it?" Not hello, not how are you, not was it hard going alone, how much was it? I said, "It's handled, Mom." She said, "Lauja, that money is part of Papa Ed's estate. It should go through the family process like everything else." I said it was a designated beneficiary account. It's not part of the estate legally. She said, "I don't think that's right. I think you need to talk to the estate lawyer before you make any decisions." I said I already talked to the bank manager and I understand the process clearly. She said, "Lauja, Papa Ed loved all of us. I don't think he would have wanted this to be kept separate from the family." That sentence sat between us like something she had rehearsed. I said he set it up separately 15 years ago on purpose. She went quiet again, and then something shifted in her voice. It became softer, a little hurt sounding. She said, "I just feel left out. He was my father, and now there's all this going on and you won't even tell me the details." I recognized that shift. I had seen it my whole life. When directness failed, the feeling arrived, the soft wound that was really a tool. I said, "I'm sorry this is painful for you, but this account is mine. Papa Ed set it up for me. The paperwork is clear. I'm not going to give you the details because there's nothing to discuss." She said, "I can't believe you're being like this." I said, "I love you, Mom. I'll talk to you soon." And I ended the call. I want to be honest with you about how that felt because I know from the outside it might look easy. It was not. My hand was shaking when I put the phone down. I sat on my couch for a long time afterward and just breathed, because saying a clear, calm, firm no to my mother was something I had almost no practice with. My whole life had been built around softening myself to avoid her discomfort. This moment was the opposite of every reflex I had. But I did not call her back. I did not soften the boundary. I sat with the discomfort and let it be uncomfortable. The next call came from Uncle Cass. Uncle Cass was warmer than my mother by nature, but he was also a man who followed whoever had the most energy in the room. In family dynamics, that was almost always my mother. He called me on a Tuesday evening and started with small talk, asking about my job and whether I had eaten well lately, the way someone does when they are building toward a point. I waited. He eventually said, "Listen, Lauja, your mom is really upset. She feels like Papa Ed might not have fully understood what he was setting up with that account, like maybe he didn't realize it would bypass the estate." I said, "Papa Ed set that account up 15 years ago and updated the beneficiary designation at least twice according to the bank records. He understood exactly what he was doing." Uncle Cass was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Well, what I mean is he wasn't fully himself toward the end. His memory wasn't what it used to be." I felt something go cold in me. I said, "Uncle Cass, are you suggesting Papa Ed lacked capacity when he set up that account? Because the account was established 15 years ago when he was completely well, and the bank has documentation." He backtracked immediately. He said, "No, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it might be worth having a conversation as a family." I said, "I'm willing to have a conversation, but the account is mine. That part is not going to change." He said, "Lauja, we're family, family shares." I said family also shows up. I showed up for Papa Ed. For years, I drove him to appointments. I sat with him on Saturdays. I was there when he passed. Where were the conversations about sharing then? Uncle Cass went very quiet. I said, I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think somewhere inside you, you know it's true. He cleared his throat. He said he would talk to my mother. He said he hoped things would not become difficult. He said he loved me. I told him I loved him too and ended the calls. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at my kitchen window for a while, looking at the street below. I noticed that I felt steadier than I expected. Not triumphant, not angry, just steady, like something that had been slightly misaligned in me for a very long time had quietly moved back into the right position. The thing I had never understood when I was younger was that keeping the peace was not the same as having peace. I had spent years keeping the peace in my family, staying small, not asking too much, not claiming too much, softening my edges so other people would not feel uncomfortable around me, and I had called that love, I had called it maturity, I had called it being the responsible one. But Papa Ed had seen something different. He had seen a woman who deserved room. The letter sat on my bedside table now, where his passbook used to sit on his. About a week after the call with Uncle Cass, my cousin Britta sent me a message. Britta was 24 and had always been pleasant enough toward me, but she lived in a very different world from mine. Her parents had comfortable money, and she had grown up with the assumption that things would generally work out for her. She was not a bad person, but she had the particular blindness of someone who had never really been without. Her message said, Hey Lauja, I just think it would be really beautiful if you considered sharing some of what Grandpa left, since he loved all of us equally and I know he wouldn't want the family to feel divided. Just a thought, love you. I read that message 3 times. I noticed the specific language. Beautiful, equally, wouldn't want the family to feel divided. All of it designed to make refusals seem ungenerous, selfish, divisive. All of it putting the weight of family harmony onto my willingness to hand over something that was mine. I did know. T respond immediately. I thought about what Papa Ed would have said about that message. I thought about the letter on my bedside table. Room to breathe, room to choose, room to stop needing other people's approval. I wrote back, I love you too, Britta. The account was set up specifically for me. That decision was Grandpa's to make, and he made it thoughtfully over many years. I hope you can respect that. She did not reply. Marcus, her brother, was less diplomatic. He called me 3 days later and was more direct. He said he thought it was strange that Grandpa had set up a whole separate account without telling anyone. He said it felt secretive. He said some people in the family were wondering if I had somehow influenced Papa Ed to do it, especially in his last years when he was more vulnerable. That word, influenced, I knew exactly what it meant. I said, Marcus, I want to be very careful here. What you're describing is a serious accusation. You are suggesting I manipulated an elderly man into putting money in my name. That is not something to say lightly. He stumbled a little. He said he was not saying that exactly. I said, then be precise about what you are saying. He could not be. He fumbled and eventually said he was just raising concerns. I said the account was established 15 years ago. I was 16. Papa Ed was in full health. I had no idea it existed until Gerald Osei called me 4 days after the funeral. If you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, you should bring it to a lawyer. Otherwise, I think we both know this conversation has reached its end. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat with the reality of what had just happened. My family was circling. They had moved through stages quickly, first confusion, then soft pressure, then guilt, and now something that edged toward accusation. I had watched that progression before, but always from the outside, always in other people's families. Having it aimed at me felt different, more personal, more clarifying. It clarified exactly who these people were in a crisis, not who I had hoped they were. I called Gerald the next morning. I asked him a question I had been turning over for several days. I asked if there was any record of who Papa Ed had spoken to at the bank when he had updated the beneficiary designation the last time. Gerald checked. He told me Papa Ed had come in personally 2 years before he passed. He had brought documentation and had a long conversation with one of their trust officers, and he had left a note in the file. The note said, This account is for my granddaughter Lauja. It is not a mistake. It is not a moment of confusion. It is a 15-year decision made with full knowledge and full intention. Please ensure she receives it directly and without interference. Papa Ed had anticipated this. He had written the rebuttal to Marcus's accusation 2 years before Marcus made it. I asked Gerald if that note was part of the official file. He said yes. I asked if it could be provided in writing if I ever needed it. He said absolutely. I thanked him and ended the call. And then I went to my bedroom and sat with the letter again, and I thought about my grandfather, this quiet man who grew tomatoes and marigolds and spoke carefully and watched everything. He had known his family. He had known their patterns. He had loved them in the ways you can love people who disappoint you from a steady, honest distance. And he had made sure that the one person who had actually been present would not be left to fight for what he intended her to have. He had done all of that quietly, without drama, without confrontation, without asking anyone's permission. I understood then that I had been watching him my whole life and learning something without realizing it. The next development came from an unexpected direction. About 10 days after Marcus's call, I received a letter from a lawyer I did not recognize. The letterhead was from a firm called Aldrich and Stein. The letter stated that my mother and Uncle Cass were exploring whether the bank account in question might be subject to estate claims given questions about Papa Ed's mental capacity in his later years. I read that letter 3 times standing in my hallway still wearing my coat. They were going to try to use Papa Ed's age and health decline as a weapon. They were going to try to argue that he had not been sound enough to make his financial decisions. The man who had written a precise, organized, clearly intentional note to his bank manager 2 years before he died. The man who had set up the account 15 years before that when he was in perfect health. I sat down and made a list of everything I knew to be true. I called a lawyer of my own that afternoon. Her name was Patricia Wren, and a colleague at my hospital had mentioned her once as someone who handled estate disputes with particular clarity and care. I explained the situation to Patricia in full. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "They are going to have a very difficult time making that argument. The timeline alone is almost insurmountable for them. A 15-year account history with updated designations with a documented note from the account holder stating his intent explicitly, that is not the profile of someone whose capacity was in question." I felt something loosen in my chest. Patricia said she would send a response letter to Aldrich and Stein on my behalf. She said the letter would do 2 things: make clear that I was represented and invite them to review the documentation that the bank held before proceeding any further. She said in her experience, that kind of response letter often ended the inquiry before it properly began, because once the opposition understood the documentation that existed, the risk calculation changed. She was right. I heard nothing from Aldrich and Stein for 2 weeks. Then Patricia received a brief reply stating that her clients were reviewing the matter further and would be in touch. We never heard from them again on the legal question. The attempt had collapsed under the weight of the very documentation Papa Ed had ensured existed. But the emotional damage from those 2 weeks was real. I want to be honest about that. Knowing that my own mother and uncle had hired a lawyer to try to challenge something my grandfather had built for me over 15 years was not something I could simply rationalize away. I had known my family was complicated. I had known they could be selfish and avoidant, but this was different. This was them looking at a gift my grandfather had made for me with full awareness and intention, and deciding to take it away if they could. That knowledge settled into me like a stone into still water. It did not make a loud splash, it just sank. I went to work, I ate my meals, I took care of my apartment, I read the letter from Papa Ed every few nights before I slept, and I thought about what room meant, not the money, the idea of it, having a choice that was not built on someone else's approval or someone else's willingness to include me. I thought about calling my mother, not to fight, not to settle anything, just to talk. I did not call her because I realized that what I wanted from that call was not available. I wanted her to understand that what she had done hurt me, and I wanted that understanding to cost her something. I wanted her to feel the weight of choosing the garbage bag over the passbook, of saying it's probably nothing without looking, of hiring a lawyer to fight a 15-year intention. But understanding does not come just because we need it to. And the version of my mother who could give me what I needed in that moment did not exist yet and might never. So I let the call stay unmade. About a month after the legal threat dissolved, something shifted in my mother's approach. She called me on a Sunday morning, which was the slot she had always reserved for Papa Ed. I noticed that detail before I even picked up. She did not start with the account. She asked about my week. She asked about a coworker I had mentioned once who had been going through a difficult time. She asked if I had been sleeping. It was a version of her that I recognized from my childhood before the years of distance had settled between us. The warm version, the trying version. After about 15 minutes, she said, "I feel like things have been difficult between us lately." I said, "They have been." She said, "I don't want it to be like this." I said, "I don't either." She said, "I think I made some choices that weren't right, about the house, about the account, about the lawyer." A pause. "I'm not proud of that last part." This was the closest my mother had ever come to an apology in my adult life. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. It felt like watching a very tall thing very slowly bend, not break, bend. I said, "Thank you for saying that." She said, "I threw that passbook away because I assumed I knew what was in it and I didn't look. I do that sometimes, assume, and I'm sorry for that." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do with it? The money? You don't have to tell me. I'm just asking because I want to understand who you are becoming." Who you are becoming, I turned that phrase over in my mind. I said, "I'm going to use it to build something that belongs to me. I don't know exactly what yet, but I'll know when I find it." She said, "Papa Ed would like that." I said, "I think so too." We stayed on the phone for another 10 minutes. We talked about small things. The garden at Papa Ed's house, which had been sold with the property, whether the new owners would keep the lemon tree. We did not fully repair what had broken between us in those conversations after the funeral. That would take more than one Sunday morning call. But we did something that felt like the beginning of honesty, which was more than I had expected. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a while. I thought about how much of my life I had spent watching that lemon tree exist through Papa Ed's stories and wondering if I would ever see it. He always said it produced the sourest lemons you could imagine, but that the sourness was the point. He said anything that grows strong enough to outlast the person who planted it has earned the right to be exactly what it is. I thought about that for a long time. Healing from what my family had done during those weeks was not a quick or clean process. I want to be real with you about that because these stories often skip the after. The after is the part where the legal threat is gone and the apology has been offered and the dust has settled, and you're still sitting in your apartment on a Wednesday evening wondering how to feel about the people you love who also hurt you. I did not have a tidy answer for that, I still do not. What I had instead was clarity, and clarity I was learning was worth more than comfort. Clarity let me see my mother and uncle and cousins for exactly who they were without needing them to be different in order for me to function. They were people who had chosen their interests over my inheritance when it mattered. They had also, in some cases, come back and offered something that looked like regret. Both of those things were true at the same time. I could hold both, that was new for me. Uncle Cass called once more about 6 weeks after the legal thing dissolved. He was gentler this time. He asked how I was doing and meant it, I think. He said he and my mother had talked. He said he wished he had been more thoughtful during those early weeks. He said Papa Ed had clearly known what he was doing and that he should have trusted that from the beginning instead of letting fear make his decisions. I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Uncle Cass." He said he loved you, he talked about you all the time, more than I realized when he was alive. I said, "I know that now." He said, "I think I was a little jealous of it, honestly, when I was younger. He always seemed to worry about you in a way that he didn't worry about the rest of us. I didn't understand it then. I think I understand it better now." I asked him what he understood now that he hadn't then. He said, "I think he worried about you because you were the one who cared without keeping score, and he knew that kind of person sometimes gets left with nothing. He didn't want that for you." I sat with that for a moment. I said he made sure of it. Uncle Cass laughed a little at that, not unkindly, the way people laugh when something is true and also a little sharp. We talked for a while longer. I did not tell him the full amount in the account. I did not think he needed to know. But I told him that I was planning to use some of it to take a course I had been wanting to take for years, a healthcare administration program that would open different doors at the hospital where I worked, and that I was thinking about moving into a better apartment, not an extravagant one, just one where the windows did not rattle and the heating was reliable. He said that sounded good. He said it sounded like something Papa Ed would approve of. I said I hoped so. After I ended that call, I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea the way Papa Ed liked it. A little strong, with just a small amount of sugar, the kind of sweetness that does not overpower the thing itself. I sat at my kitchen table with the tea and the letter, and I let myself be exactly where I was. I want to tell you about what I did with the money, not because the amounts matter, but because the choices do. I enrolled in the healthcare administration program 3 months after Papa Ed passed. It was 18 months long and required dedication on evenings and weekends alongside my job, but I had always been capable of that kind of sustained effort. I had been sustaining effort quietly and without recognition for years. The difference now was that the effort was for me. I moved apartments 4 months in. I found a place on the third floor of a well-maintained building with south-facing windows that let in real sunlight. The heating worked. The pipes were quiet. There was a small balcony where I put 2 planters and grew cherry tomatoes along one side like Papa Ed had done along his fence. I put a portion of the money into a certificate of deposit at the same bank where Papa Ed had kept the account. Gerald helped me set it up. When I came in to do the paperwork, he shook my hand with both of his and said Papa Ed had always spoken of me with such warmth that it was a privilege to help carry out his intentions. I thanked him and meant it more than I could say. The rest I kept in a savings account that I touched only for planned, thoughtful reasons. I did not make dramatic announcements to my family about any of this. I did not need them to know the detail. The choices were mine and they were quiet, the same way Papa Ed's plan had been quiet. My mother came to see my new apartment about 5 months after I moved in. She brought flowers, which I appreciated. She stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the street and said it was a nice place. She noticed the cherry tomato planters on the balcony. She did not say anything about them directly, but she stood at the balcony door for a long moment and looked at them, and something moved across her face that I cannot fully name, something between recognition and loss. I made her tea, a little strong with just enough sugar. She sat at my kitchen table and drank it and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "You're going to be okay, Lauja, aren't you?" It was not really a question. I said, "Yes, I think I am." She nodded slowly. She looked like she wanted to say more. Maybe she wanted to say she was sorry for the lawyer. Maybe she wanted to say she was sorry for the garbage bag. Maybe she wanted to say she was sorry for all the years of managing the distance between them and calling it a normal relationship. Maybe she just wanted to say she saw me the way Papa Ed had seen me and that she was sorry it had taken her this long. She did not say any of those things, but she stayed for 2 hours, and she asked about my program and listened when I explained it, and before she left, she touched the edge of one of the tomato planters on the balcony and said, "These are going to produce well. You've got them in exactly the right light." That was the closest she came to it, and for now it was enough. Some things take longer than a conversation to change. Some people need time to understand what they missed before they can begin to repair it. I had spent a long time wanting my mother to move faster, to see more clearly, to love more openly. I was learning to let people be where they were without requiring them to move at the speed of my healing. That was its own kind of freedom. Marcus reached out once more, about 8 months after everything had settled. He sent a message that said he had been thinking and that he believed he owed me an apology for what he had implied on that phone call. He said he knew he had gone further than he should have and that he was ashamed of it. I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. I accepted. I hope you're doing well." That was all, not cold, not warm, honest. He replied, "You're more gracious than I deserved." I thought about that, about what grace actually was, not unlimited forgiveness that costs you nothing, not pretending things did not happen. Grace was the ability to see clearly and still choose not to be bitter. It was the decision to carry your truth without needing everyone else to also carry the weight of your anger. Papa Ed had been gracious. He had not been angry at his children for the ways they had maintained their distance. He had simply worked around them quietly and purposefully to make sure the person who had been there would have what she needed. I wanted to be more like that. Britta I heard from less. She was cordial when we saw each other at a small family gathering about a year later. She did not bring up the message she had sent or the response I had given. We talked about small things and moved through the event without conflict. That was probably the best that could be done, and I found I was fine with it. The gathering was at Uncle Cass's house. It was a birthday celebration for my mother, 62 years old. There was food and music and the kind of family energy that moves between warmth and mild tension depending on who is standing near whom. I brought flowers, white ones which my mother liked. At some point during the evening, I found myself standing in Uncle Cass's kitchen while most of the guests were in the living room, and Uncle Cass came in to get more ice and found me there. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You look different than you did a year ago." I said, "Different how?" He said, "Settled, like you've put something down." I thought about that. "I think that's accurate," I said. He nodded. He filled the ice bucket and then paused at the door and said, "Papa Ed would be proud of you, Lauja, not because of the money, because of how you handled it." I said I had a good teacher. He smiled at that and went back into the living room, and I stayed in the kitchen for another moment alone. Settled, I turned the word over in my mind. It was exactly right. Something I had been carrying for a very long time, the need to be chosen, the need to be seen, the need to have someone in my family confirm that I had value had finally been set down. Not because the money had given me that, because the letter had. Because the note Papa Ed had left at the bank had. Because 15 years of quiet, consistent, deliberate love from a man who grew tomatoes and believed in the lasting power of things had finally reached me in a form I could hold. I had been seen, I had always been seen, I just had not known it. The program I enrolled in ended 14 months after I started it. I passed the final assessments with marks I was genuinely proud of. My supervisor at the hospital had already been aware that I was working toward the qualification, and 3 weeks after I completed it, she called me into her office and offered me a new position. A coordinator role with expanded responsibilities, a real title, and a significant pay increase. I accepted it on the spot. I called Gerald that afternoon to tell him. He laughed and said that sounded like exactly what Papa Ed would have hoped to hear. I said I thought so too. That evening I sat on my balcony with a glass of water and looked at my cherry tomato plants, which had done exactly as my mother predicted. They had produced abundantly all summer, bright red and a little sharp and entirely alive. I thought about the lemon tree in Papa Ed's old garden. I thought about whether the new owners had kept it. I hoped they had. I hoped someone was standing under it even now and not quite understanding yet why it moved them the way it did. Some things outlast the people who start them. Papa Ed had told me that himself, standing in that garden with his hand on the bark of that old tree. I had not understood then that he was talking about more than the tree. He was talking about the account in the navy blue passbook. He was talking about the letter with the careful handwriting. He was talking about 15 years of $20 deposits and $50 deposits and quiet, loving, purposeful intention. He was talking about me. I am Lauja. I am 32 years old now, and I am building something that belongs to me slowly and deliberately and without asking anyone's permission. I have a job that values what I offer. I have an apartment with good light. I have cherry tomatoes on a south-facing balcony. I have a letter on my bedside table that tells me I was always seen. And I have learned at last that love without presence is not love. It is management, and management is not what I was made for. I was made to be seen. Papa Ed made sure I knew it. And finally, after 31 years of showing up and being steady and driving to appointments and sitting on Saturday afternoons and making tea with just the right amount of sugar, I had stopped waiting for the rest of the world to agree. I knew it myself. That was the whole point. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. Think about the people in your life who have shown up quietly, without announcement, without keeping score, the ones who drove when you needed a ride and sat with you when the room was too big to be in alone. Have you told them what they meant to you? Have you made sure they know you see them? Papa Ed never said it in words until he had to. He said it in 15 years of deposits and a sealed letter and a bank manager who remembered his name. You do not have to wait that long. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me about someone who showed up for you when it mattered. Their name deserves to be said out loud. And if you are the one who has been quietly showing up for everyone else, I want you to hear this directly. You were always seen. You just needed someone to say it.